Teresa Burton is the editor of Unity's Daily Word publication, and every month she sends a brief note from the editor email, and it typically includes some of her personal insights on any various life experiences that we can have. And so I wanted to share a part of what she wrote in her email from March 3rd of 2020. And she titled that one, When Hearts Break Open. And she said, life can be hard and it can hurt, no matter how much spiritual awareness we try to bring to it. Judging ourselves for not always being sunny and upbeat compounds the hurt and estranges us from life's rhythms. Flowing with the current of life, its ebbs and flows, gives us a buoyancy to withstand even the roughest waters. And perhaps paradoxically, a rootedness that keeps us standing strong against waves that might otherwise topple us. What if the best way to live is to be open and accepting of everything? Maybe our prayer shouldn't be that we are spared from life's harshness and that our hearts never break. Let's pray instead for the willingness to let our hearts break open and to grow in empathy and compassion so that our joys and sorrows, our pleasures and our pains bind us together. I believe there is no endeavor more spiritual than that. And that is what we're going to try to do today. We're going to look at grief as the powerful spiritual practice that it can be. And so to begin, I just want to offer you what I found to be a wonderful resource on grief from Unity. I've mentioned these before, but it's one of the booklets, and its title is one that I borrowed from my lesson title today, which is Grief is a Spiritual Practice. And so like all of the booklets that I reference on Community, you can just download it directly onto your computer from their website or request a hard copy. And that address is www.unity.org/publications/booklets. And you'll find not only this one that I've used for grief, but also a host of other booklets on so many other aspects of life and the inspirational writings that can help us all move through them. And so some of what I'll be offering today comes from that booklet on grief. And I wanted to ground our perspective about grief that we'll be using today by sharing just a little bit from the introduction to that particular booklet. And it shared that loss can change the trajectory of a life. It shifts our days and interrupts our nights. It breaks open our hearts and forces us to reckon with the big questions of life. Where is God? Who am I now? How do I pray? Over time, grief actually becomes a spiritual practice. At Unity, we hear from people whose grief is fresh, as well as those who missed loved ones from long ago. We hear anguish and gratitude, darkness and light from those in the valley of the shadow of death. Grief takes as long as it takes, and there is no right or wrong way to express it. Nor does it really end. Instead, we gradually take new shape around it. And so those words contain some of the elements of our foundation today. Grief does not have a set timetable. There is no right way. There is no wrong way to grieve. Many people do believe and have experienced so far, at least, that grief never really does end. That rather we should simply reshape our lives around its presence. So perhaps the best way to step into the experience, into the process of grief, is to first address some of what have been called the mistaken myths that some may believe about grief. And these myths were in a book that's titled The Grief Recovery Handbook. For your reference, it was written by two gentlemen, John James and Russell Friedman. And they are myths that, when believed, tend to set up unrealistic expectations about our process around grief, our experience of it, our ability to move through it. And there are 7 of them, and I'm just going to share just briefly about each of them, as I think that they are pretty clear and to the point just in the title of each. And the first of those says that we must be strong for others, Be strong for others. And this is one I've witnessed in my family, over many years now, as well as in many opportunities I've had to witness the grief of others throughout my ministerial career. And the belief is that if we can show strength, then we can spare others from the pain and the sorrow that's associated with the loss. And many times, the others, when they see us seemingly holding it all together, well, then they tend to hold back their true feelings, their true emotions. But the reality is that all of us in a given situation are experiencing pain to some degree. And so feeling and showing ours gives others permission to show theirs as well. And it also provides a wonderful example for our children as to the importance of the okayness of feeling their emotions, as opposed to growing up learning how to ignore them or bury them. The second myth is that we should replace the loss. If you get a divorce, hurry up and get remarried. If you lose a child, have another baby right away as soon as possible. And trying to rush in and replace what's been lost is not always the most healthy of mindsets to have. Even when someone does remarry or has another child or adopts another pet or gets another job, none of them replace what was lost. Light bulbs are replaceable, but those kinds of relationships are not. So if the idea ever comes up, I encourage you to try to let go of the idea that you have to replace what you have lost. Instead, grieve what you have lost. Grieve those experiences, knowing that in the time that is perfect for you, new relationships are going to come along. And they will come along when your heart is ready to really be fully present to them, and in turn sustain them in healthy ways going forward. Myth number 3 is just give it time. Just give it time. Now, I have never, I should say, I cannot recall ever hearing anyone tell me that they firmly believe in that adage that time heals all wounds. I've been told many times that time eases the pain, but I cannot recall anybody ever telling me that time heals all wounds. And I tend to believe that because of what I've seen as a minister. People who attend a memorial service, maybe just in support of someone who has actually experienced a loss, they will come up to me after the service and say that grief of theirs from years ago was reignited in that particular service. I have seen parents reliving the death of their child as I have been christening a newborn baby of someone else. A dear work colleague of mine, this goes back to 1983, she did not come to my wedding because her fiance broke up with her about a week before, and she was in far too much pain to be able to witness a wedding and be in that energy of love and joy and new beginnings for me and my husband. Myth number 4 is that we are to grieve privately. We are to grieve privately. And this is one of those things that can be almost like a two-way street, because people in grief will sometimes isolate themselves, right? And at the same time, those around them may unknowingly encourage that isolation when they think it's best to give someone in grief their space. And so the best thing to do is just ask. Ask the person what they need. And if they say they need to be alone, give them that space. And remain alert as to when that being in their space seems to be going on a little bit too long. Because by that time, sometimes that person might not even know how to reach out, even when they know it's the very thing that they meant. Myth number 5, don't talk about it. Don't talk about your grief, and nothing could be further from the truth. Talking is healing. And our listening, I've said this many times before, is one of the greatest gifts that we can give to another, especially when they're going through a difficult time. And when we do speak, that healing can continue if we speak without judgment, if we speak and refrain from advising or counseling unless we're asked, when we say the name out loud of the person, the pet, whatever it is that the person has lost. And when we try not to fix the person, all someone usually wants is to be heard. Now, I imagine that many of us may have employed this next myth, and that is keeping busy. Keeping busy. We just fill every second of our day with something to do, something else, and we won't have to accept what is happening. We won't have to feel our feelings. We won't have to deal with our feelings. And yet all of that does is distract us from what is, and only temporarily with that. And then it may make the day go by quickly, but then what happens? The day turns into night, and we fall into bed, probably exhausted because of all that we've been doing. And we fall into bed with a hole that remains in our hearts. And the final myth, I don't want to forget. I don't want to forget. And someone may say this when they believe that any thought, let alone any action of moving forward with their life, will cause them to forget the one who has died. Remember before when I said that time doesn't heal all wounds, that the wounds remain? Well, yes, they do remain. However, when they reappear, they're at new levels of healing that can occur as well. So one of those levels to reach is the knowing that moving on is not about forgetting. It is about enjoying sacred memories with less and less pain over time. And I can offer just one personal note on this one. Just, I guess it was 3 weeks ago now, it was Mother's Day, and I was talking to my mom that afternoon, and she commented that with Memorial Day approaching, she was remembering my dad. Because my dad passed away on May 24th of 1985. And so as she was talking to me, she said that, this is the 36th anniversary of Daddy's dying. And she said, I've now been a widow longer than I've been married. See, she and my dad had a wonderful 35-year marriage. And believe me, over the last 36 years, my mom has moved on. She has filled her life with her family, her friends. She has traveled. She does things that are fun for her. She's totally committed and involved with her church community, the community service in her area. She has stepped into the role as the matriarch of our family for the last 25 of those years. And she's made a huge impact, continue to make that impact on our family, on the people around her. So she has definitely moved on, but she has never once forgotten my dad. So maybe she's one example of the next aspect of grief that I'd like to explore. And that is that we can reach a point where there is more love than pain. More love than pain. That was the title to an article in Unity magazine last year. It was written by a gentleman named David Kessler, who authored a book called Finding Meaning, which is the 6th stage of grief. And he put forth that fully experiencing our pain after a loved one dies is the best way to start finding meaning in their passing. He noted that the common belief around grief is that it's all about pain. And of course, it is all about pain. However, he also believes that we tend to see that pain as being the absence of love. The absence of love. But the love is still there. Just like it was for my mom. The love does not die when the person dies. And so here's the question that David put forth. He said, how do we learn to remember that person with more love than pain? And he noted that this is a question, not a mandate. It's a question, not a mandate. He said, there is no getting around the pain. We have to go through it because it is the inevitable result of the separation we are experiencing. And it is a brutal, forced separation. There's no getting around the pain. So here's how we can take a shorter route to the place where love begins to outweigh the pain. And it's one of many ways, I'm sure, but it is to be like a buffalo. Be like a buffalo. How many thought they'd hear that this morning, right? But here's the deal. What I learned is that when there is a storm, a brutal storm taking place out in nature, buffalo will run straight into it. They will run straight into it. And by doing so, they minimize the time they'll be in it. So let's apply that to ourselves and to our pain. If we run straight into it, then what are we not doing? We're not running from it. We're not trying to ignore it. We're not hoping it's just magically going to disappear one day. In other words, we're not doing the very things that serve to maximize the time we are in it. Another way to get closer to where love is, there's more love than pain, is to stay with what Mr. Kessler referred to as the first generation of emotions. The first generation of emotions. So we think about a time when we've been in grief, or just, in general, the kinds of emotions that can come up in a time of loss: anger, sadness, shock, yearning, numbness, all kinds of emotions that are very, very painful. And the thought of all of them rushing in at the same time at us can bring up a very real fear of being overwhelmed to the point of no return. We could never come back from that. So now think about some of the tendencies we might have when that thought shows up. And we start to feel our sadness, but then we start to feel guilty that we're sad. We feel our anger, and then we start to judge our anger. We feel into the yearning for what was, and then we berate ourselves for not feeling grateful enough for what we have. And because of all these pauses and pivots, we're adding a generation to our pain. Now there's not only sadness, now there's guilt. There's not only anger, but now there's judgment. There's not only just, yearnings, but now there's a self-flagellation going on. And each of these is adding a generation to the pain. So when we stay with the first generation of our emotions, when we take that plunge and allow ourselves to feel them at depth, we may indeed feel their intensity, but we will not be overwhelmed. We will have felt the emotion fully and be done with it. And we will not relive that particular emotion in that way ever again. Now, yes, pain may come back from that loss. It may return, but it will be from a new place. It will be from a new place, and that is that new level of healing that is now ready and calling out for the next level of healing to take place. Marianne Williamson once wrote that if you have 100 tears to cry, you can't stop at 50. She said the secret to remembering with love again begins with accepting the pain, not trying to deny it, not trying to ignore it. When we do accept, when we are fully present to our feelings of grief, we are allowing it to just find its natural course. Natural course, knowing that it will eventually ease and or pass with time. So far, so much of what I've shared is a reminder that the human feelings and emotions are incredibly powerful. They can sometimes overpower us, and they can often give us great power. So it's important to allow ourselves to be human in our times of grief. I mean, even those with great depth of faith and strong spiritual beliefs can lose sight of God's presence. Even those people can get angry at God. I've gotten angry at God many, many times. I consider it one of the most powerful prayers I can say in my mind, to just let the anger out. Allow yourself to be human. Allow others their humanness when you're offering your support. Sometimes all of those spiritual assurances, they're best offered and more easily received after we've had the time to be with the humanness of our pain. Because once we've been with it, it is done. And there is this wonderful clearing that helps us to once again see and feel and receive that comfort and loving presence of God. Our Unity booklet suggested that over time, grief actually becomes a spiritual practice over time. If you take 2 words home with you today from this particular lesson, maybe those are it. Over time, when you're in grief. See, time is a human construct. And sometimes that human construct is the very thing that reminds us of the timelessness of spirit. That no matter how much time we may need before turning more fully to Spirit's presence, it will not only be there when we do, it will have been there all along. Over time, we may employ our spiritual practices to try to break free from that never-ending daily dose of grief. And we may find that none of that is being of much help. And we're back once again with all of our feelings and all of our emotions. But perhaps there is another spiritual practice that at those points we have not yet considered. And it's often the last one that we consider when we're in the midst of the power of our emotions. And that's surrender. A spiritual surrendering to the grief. Spiritual surrendering to the grief. It's there that we not only can feel our feelings, but also allow them to give us every step, every turn, every direction we need to get to the part of us that needs the most healing in that moment. You see, anger will guide us to resentments whose time to be released has now come. Confusion will lead us to questions that will then lead us to clarity and answers. Loneliness will guide us to know that until we more fully love ourselves, we will carry around with us the fear of ever loving someone else again. Perhaps the greatest message of grief is that of love. In the words of one of my ministerial colleagues, Ogun Holder, who lost his wife to cancer 5 or 6 years ago now, at a very young age. He said, love got us into this in the first place. We grieve because we love. And the more we love, the greater the grief. If we let it, grief will take us back to love. Love is all there is. So on this beautiful day in this sacred amphitheater on our grounds, when we say that love is all there is, let us say, and so it is, and so we do our very best to let it be. God bless you.